its relevance to art is what we're interested in here. And what I like, let me kick off the discussion by saying, it raises the whole question of what did art emerge for? What's the purpose of art? As a biologist, somebody interested in evolution and interested in the brain, my question is, what purpose does art serve? What did it involve? One possibility, it doesn't serve any purpose. I mean, it just happens that your visual system is wired in a particular way to detect objects and to create conceptual ideas about the world. An artist can exploit this to excite your brain areas to create pleasing effects. It did not evolve for any specific purpose. The other possibility is it did evolve for a specific purpose. If so, what might it be? Well, think back in our early days in our ancestors who were doing cave art, right? Maybe at that time they were not very good at imagery. It turns out when you now imagine a rose in front of you, people have discovered that not only is there high-level memory activated of the rose, but you're doing a virtual reality simulation of that rose in your brain. It actually excites the visual sensory areas of that rose in your brain. So it's as though the memory information is fed back all the way down to the sensory regions of the brain when you imagine a rose. So when you look at a rose, of course, there's bottom-up, eyeball, visual cortex, higher visual areas, memory, and all of that. That's obvious, right? When you remove the rose and ask them to imagine it, the same thing happens in reverse, right? So you're doing a virtual reality in your brain. But maybe this is a new invention. Obviously, even now, we're not perfect at doing this. I mean, I can imagine having a banquet here. But if I was perfect at imagining it, I wouldn't go and eat. And I would starve to death. So any creature that could imagine perfectly that it would have a banquet would starve to death. As Shakespeare said, you cannot cloy the hungry edge of appetite by bare imagination of a feast. Right? And just as well, similarly, if I could just imagine orgasms, a creature that had a gene mutation that allowed it to imagine orgasms wouldn't reproduce. It would just sit there imagining. So if you go back to the days of the cave, to our ancestral hominids, maybe their power of imagery was even more impoverished. So if they wanted to rehearse a bison hunt, you could do it in your mind and then teach your kids. But at that time, imagery was not that good. So you have to create art, pictures of bison and bison hunts, to show your child or show your husband how to hunt a bison, right? When he's looking at it. So maybe art is nature's own virtual reality. The first example of the brain's creation of virtual reality. So that would be one way of how it might have evolved. But maybe there are other views, I don't know.
I thought...
Sorry, that took 5 minutes.
Okay. Back to the question that Ron asked is the mirror box art? And from my perspective, it's calling something, when you decide to call something art or not, kind of misses the point. When I set out to do my work, I'm actually very often deliberately trying to avoid certain conventions of art and really just think about the effect, the kind of excitation that whatever I'm doing is going to stimulate in me. And so, I think the mirror box is very clearly a stimulating thing. It's operating through our perceptions and affecting the mind. I think the intentionality behind it, we could get into a philosophical debate about, how important that is. For me, I've often thought that things that I would do, was a time when I would do these things very anonymously and not really concern myself with my intentionality being known, actually setting up situations that might have looked like they would actually happen naturally, just sort of a random occurrence, but it was an interesting sort of arrangement, and hopefully it would have stimulated people, and that was the point. So,
well, can I say something? One of the very intriguing things about your work of art, or works of art, I should say, and I've seen this in other works of art, is humor plays a tremendous role. And I think this takes us to the whole question of the overlap between art and science, which Bronowski is very interested in. Do they have anything in common? It's a creative act in science. Is science a cold, rational, Sherlock Holmes-like deductive process where art is all about being creative? Well, actually, that's not true, because in both instances, both in art and in science, it involves unusual juxtapositions of ideas. And many great scientists who I have met, have the privilege of meeting, who are outstanding, creative, and original scientists, usually have a very good sense of humor. Now, of course, there are a lot of German scientists who are very good. But extremely creative and original and all of that. But in general, they have a very good sense of humor. So I think that it was very appealing to me when I saw all the humor in your works of art. Now, I don't know if that's universally true, but one of the things I've long suggested is, in our school systems, we should introduce a lot of jokes and humor, much more than people, because it involves looking at things from unusual vantage points. That's what you're doing in your works of art. Something that to most people who look up here utterly trivial, or using the mirror box, for example, look utterly trivial, you see deep significance in that when you create it, and then it's a great work of art. I don't know about the light bulb in me, but
I was thinking of that light bulb akin to the bird's beak.
Yeah.
You just strip away the bird, and it's a little more intense. And I think the tension of that, read a nice philosophical question from an architect that I've been studying lately, which was, what do we live for? Do we live for comfort, or do we live for moments of intensity? And I think that it's a rhetorical question, debatable, but the moments of intensity, I think, is what this is all about. And so, I've got a question for you, which is, you talked about when we spoke before about the kind of relationship of perception and conception in the mind. And I as a conceptual artist have been thinking about this, but I'm also, as I said, a visual artist. And things like metaphor, you explained to me how metaphor can be both visual and a kind of conception. And I'm wondering where you see things like irony. Is there a visual irony that's purely visual, not connected to our kind of understanding of the status of things?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, first of all, in terms of physiology and brain function, in the old days they would say there's a sharp distinction between perception, which is on autopilot, and perception of color, form, shape, and all that, and high-level conception, which is involved memory and knowledge of individual objects. But the boundaries being increasingly blurred as we learn more and more about the brain. So your question about conception and perception is very legitimate. In terms of irony, of course, you start thinking of things like surrealist art, which sort of straddles the boundary between perceptual, merely perceptual, and conceptual. I mean, the surrealism, conceptual or perceptual. And that would be an example of something on the boundary. In terms of metaphor, of course, metaphor is conceptual, like it is the yeast and Juliet is the sun, so it's a metaphor. But at the same time, visual art, people use metaphor all the time, and I've seen this in Indian art. Something like a good example for me is contrast. Contrast is a simple physical principle, red and green, or blue and yellow, or black and white, or gray and white. And this is, of course, an essential part of visual art. Doesn't explain visual art, but that's where you begin. But you can also have high-level contrast, which is more conceptual. Like many Indian sculptures of women, voluptuous nymphs with smooth, supple skin. You have very Baroque jewelry. And the intention there is to contrast the Baroque jewelry, which is very elaborate, with the suppleness and smoothness of the skin, to make it seem even more smooth and sensuous and supple. So this is not really perceptual, it's more conceptual, but it works. And similarly, the dance of Shiva, for example, is highly conceptual, and yet it's conveyed through visual medium. So I think you raise a very interesting questions there. I'm not sure you can answer them, but very interesting questions.